All right, it's 3 o'clock Eastern time, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you, everyone, for coming here today. Welcome to the Aerospace Corporation Center for Space Policy and Strategies event, Growing the Space Warfighter, Opportunities and Challenges for Space Force Personnel. We've had, to say the least, a very intense week around the country, so thank you for choosing to spend some of your time today with us. My name is Robin Dickey, and I'm a CSPS Space Policy and Strategy Analyst. We have a great day in store for you, but first, some quick housekeeping notes. As a reminder, this event will be recorded, and we ask you all to keep your microphones on mute and your video cameras off. You're welcome to use the chat box to pose questions and comments to our speakers. Moderators will review and consolidate the questions so that, time permitting, we can add some audience questions to the live Q&A with our guests. Please keep your questions and comments professional, relevant, and related to the subject. And without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce our first guest, Ms. Patricia Mulcahy. Ms. Mulcahy is the Deputy Chief of Space Operations for Personnel at the U.S. Space Force. Previously, she's served in various civilian leadership positions focused on personnel and human resources for the U.S. Air Force, following a distinguished 29-year career in the U.S. Army. Although we are meeting virtually today, I did make sure that we were able to put the fire in fireside chat. So I hope you're feeling cozy, Ms. Mulcahy, and thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Robin, for hosting. We appreciate it, and thanks for the invitation.
And for those in the audience who may not know, could you briefly describe what your role entails at the U.S. Space Force?
Yeah, thanks, Robin, for asking. So very broadly, I'm responsible for all human capital strategies, the policies, and the programs that are in support of our guardians, their families, and our civilians. But I would like to just take an opportunity to take what they call that 30,000-foot view and just start with the reminder that that our space capabilities are so very critical to our national defense, and in large measures is why the Congress established us as the sixth branch of the armed forces. And so with that, we have this important mission to organize, to train, and to equip our space forces so that we can provide space capabilities and that we can combat the new and the future threats that we know that are out there to maintain our space superiority. So to deter space through this position of strength, you're going to do that in large measures through your human capital, through people and the capabilities. That's what makes our Space Force. And so we're building this service uniquely focused on space operations while we're trying to create a culture that supports this highly technical yet space warfighting professional. And so we're recruiting and transferring people to support space critical career fields that include operations, you would probably expect that, as well as intelligence and cyber and acquisition and engineering. And that for our military force is predominantly what we are going to stay focused on. And as we build these career fields, we're trying to figure out what are the best approaches to develop and train our officers and our enlisted members, as well as a large cadre of civilians that will support us in many areas external to operations, intelligence, cyber acquisition, and engineering. And it gives me an opportunity to also highlight that a very important part of our Space Force is our Department of the Air Force civilians. You know, you're going to probably be interested in knowing what are we looking at size-wise. And I like to tell folks the plan that we have for the Space Force is about a 50-50 proposition. About 50% will be military and about 50% will be civilians. So just such an important part of our service. And so we also like to say that we're building this service from the ground up. And so last year we opened the window for airmen in these mission focused fields to have the opportunity to transfer to the Space Force. And now I can't believe a whole year has already flown by, but now we're focused on the integration mission as we begin to transfer members from other services and consolidate other space missions across the armed forces. And we do all of this, making sure that our service stays laser focused on the 24/7 space operations that we have done, that we will continue to do in defense of the nation. That's what we do in the human capital business.
Amazing. Thank you. No, that was a very thorough description. And so kind of building off of that, what are some of the accomplishments of the Space Force in the area of personnel that you want to highlight from your services first year, especially if you have any numbers on who's transferred so far, that would be great. And then what are some big decisions or milestones that might be coming up in the next year?
Sure. So we started out on December 19th of 2019, and we had some 16,000 airmen and civilians who were part of what we formerly called Air Force Space Command. And by authorization in the NDAA, we took all of those people and assigned them to the Space Force. Now, this is always a key point. Assign doesn't mean that you're actually in the Space Force, right? That's a whole transfer process. And so, so before we started that, we needed to figure out which organizations were not in Air Force Space Command, and they were doing space missions throughout the Air Force. And we quickly transferred some 23 organizations and about 1,900 billets over to the Space Force. And that's what got us started. At the headquarters, we started with a number of 200, pretty much split between military and civilians. And for 70 of our positions, within 2 months, we had already received more than, I always have to pause when I think about this number, 9,700 applications for 70 civilian positions here at the Pentagon and the NCR area. So then the next thing that we did is we needed to design a field command structure that would support our missions in the Space Force. And we quickly determined that we needed to align operations, systems, and readiness and training. And so when we did that, we also worked hard to collapse where it made sense, echelons of commands. And many of you maybe have heard General Raymond talk before about building this light and lean and agile force. And that's a key part of what helps you become light, lean, and agile, is taking out some of those levels of command that, because of the kind of mission focus that we have, that we did not feel that we needed. So we now have a Space Force headquarters here in the Pentagon, and it was in the October timeframe that we formally stood up the headquarters for Space Operations Command in Colorado Springs with 9 deltas, or others might know them as 06 colonel level, captain level commands. We also renamed 2 of our Space Force bases to include Patrick and Cape Canaveral, to Patrick Space Force Base and Cape Canaveral Space Force Station. We've now transferred over 2,200 airmen into the Space Force. So they are now formally either enlisted or scrolled and commissioned into the service. And we're preparing for approximately 3,600 to start this February and continue through September of this year, through the fiscal year. We also commissioned our first 86 lieutenants from the United States Air Force Academy in April, and we enlisted our first 7 recruits in October, and they graduated basic military training in December. And we've also already held our first space promotions panels and our first enlisted promotion board. So, exciting first year.
Wow, yeah, that is a busy first year.
So, so here's what we're looking to do from a personnel perspective in 2021. It's been very important to General Raymond and Chief Toberman that we have a very deliberate, holistic, well thought through human capital strategy. So that is something that we've been working on in the first year. And we did that using a technique we call, and I'm sure many are familiar with this, in agile development, called a sprint. Where you have so many hundreds of tasks and decisions that need to get made. And so you figure out which ones do you absolutely need to make, and you don't get subsumed by the other ones. You bring a small group together, you focus them for 2 or 3 days, and you come out with set objectives and set decisions. We've been using this sprint approach through much of what we've been doing in the personnel community, to include putting together a human capital strategy. So to get that done in the first year, I think has been really amazing. You're going to find that it'll have the very traditional emphasis on attract and retain, as well as develop and grow. So if I could take a minute and say, for us in the Space Force, it is critically important that we find and attract the best talent. And I could say that it could clearly be this idea of attracting talent, recruiting talent, especially because of the kinds of skills and STEM background that we need, is probably one of the most important missions that we have in the Space Force. It is also very important to us that we attract talent of the diversity that reflects our great nation. We see this as a national security imperative. And we're fortunate, we consider ourselves, to have a kind of warfighting mission that becomes a calling for people and an interest for so many of our young people. We also think that what you'll see in our human capital strategy that is different than others is twofold. One is a strong emphasis on being connected and collaborative, and a strong emphasis on being digitally enabled. So I'd like to just take a minute to tell you a little bit about what we're talking about. So from a connected and collaborative approach, we feel really strongly that what we're doing is creating a fearless organization that's built on open accountability, and it's through highly developed team-oriented constructs, small teams at that. We value continuous personal and professional assessment and real-time development and performance feedback. And we think in the human capital area that we'll deliver this to the service by harnessing some of our best leading digital capabilities and make access to data better, faster, and quicker for decision-making, what we like to call at depth. We're also being very deliberate about building within the Space Force something called an employee value proposition. This in many ways, I think, is a first for some of the services. And it includes developing engagement strategies like the question of the day that Amazon uses, and pulse surveys that other exceptional organizations use, so that we can stay connected to every member of the Space Force. And we're also looking at creating a Guardian Compact that details how Guardians are accountable to our larger enterprise and the service, and how leaders are accountable to our Guardians. And we see this as a way to unlock every member's full potential in contributing to the Space Force. You know, every Guardian, military or civilian, regardless of rank or position, is valued, and their voice is going to be important to us. And so, so let me just take another minute and talk a little bit about this digitally enabled and digital service. So this isn't just like a bolt-on for the Space Force, but we see it as the very fabric of who we are. You know, we want to make sure that folks share this fluency in programming languages and data-driven activities, so much so that the skills are familiar and second nature, like riding a bike or playing a video game. And we're reminded that space is the one domain where the operators are not physically present. So their ability to perform command and control and achieve domain awareness is truly incumbent on a digital backbone and links that traverse, you know, across the electromagnetic spectrum. So we rely on data, and we as a digital service are going to make sure that our workforce, our headquarters, and our digital engineering is all well designed and well integrated. And we think that is an important part of our human capital strategy. So then let me just also give you another recent example. So for those 7 new recruits who went off to basic military training, I had one of our chiefs come and say, you know, we call ourselves the digital service. We need to give our new members the information that they desire before they even get to basic training. So we issued them all iPads, and we had them loaded up with licenses for digital university and some very interesting training opportunities on small teams. And we found that the 7 recruits, before they even started BMT, had a collective 144 hours of course completion amongst them. So this tells us about the caliber and the quality of folks that we're able to attract, and how we want to try to digitally enable them, right from the onset. So another thing that's very important to us in this initial year is uh, looking after and constructing the best kind of plan and construct for our reserves and our National Guard. We could not be doing the mission that we do in space today without both the reserves and the National Guard. But again, as a smaller new service, we've got some ability, we believe, and some flexibility to try to develop a structure and a force that's more flexible, allows people to move a little bit more freely between the reserves and the regular during a career, and allows our Guardians to be able to get both a Space Force service opportunity as well as industry and academia. So we're very excited about some ideas and some proposals that we have to develop in this second year. Something else that we're looking at is our university partnership program. We're trying to, we know that we can't be in every single university like our sister service, the Air Force, is for ROTC, but we think if we look at those universities with ROTC programs, with education opportunities, research opportunities, with those institutions that have an expertise in aerospace, we think that we could develop a really good long-term partnership program, one that would help the universities and that would help the Space Force as well. And then the last thing that we're looking to do in the second year is to make much greater use of the various civilian personnel management system flexibilities that we already have in our Department of the Air Force and the DoD, and try to make them work for our more uniquely mission-focused service. So a little bit of what we did in 20 and a little bit of what we're doing in 21.
Yeah, that's amazing. And yeah, truly seems like the Space Force is active already, has big plans for the future. And we've talked a bit already about kind of the characteristics we see for Guardians and Space Force personnel themselves. So one thing I wanted to expand on that a lot of people have been asking about is relationship between Space Force personnel and Air Force personnel. Especially also when we're looking at differences between uniformed personnel and civilians and how they're shared across maybe differently from each other. So could you just kind of go into a little more depth about the dynamics between Space Force and Air Force when it comes to personnel?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. First and foremost, as we went through the transfer process, the right place for all space operators would be in the Space Force. And I would tell you that almost all came over, except for those that were looking to already retire or to separate. They had other career plans, or potentially were looking to do something else within the Air Force. After that, we share certain capabilities, right, with the Air Force. And frankly, we share it with the other services, specifically in intelligence and cyber and in acquisition and in engineering. And so here was a case of where we've had people who have served with space before, and they were interested to come and transfer over. Others were just intrigued by, I'm an intelligence professional, but I would like to be able to do that in space. But there are a lot of other military specialties that we'll need to support us, as well as civilian specialties. So, so we're just working very closely as a department to be able to benefit from the Air Force's medical capabilities, personnel capabilities, financial management capabilities. So you are still going to see airmen serving on what are more Space Force space traditional bases like Peterson Air Force Base or out in Vandenberg, because we are going to get those other kinds of mission support and functions from the Air Force. And I'll tell you that my colleagues in A1, it has been just a true personal and professional rewarding opportunity for us to work together in building the service, because it is going to take both the Air Force and the Space Force to be able to deliver the kind of capability that we need.
And we did have one a fairly specific question related to that of, has the Space Force created their own civilian personnel system yet? Or is that still mostly held with the Air Force?
Right. So our civilians will continue to be Department of the Air Force civilian. Now, within the Department of the Air Force, there are some different personnel management systems, right? So there's one that's unique for intelligence. There's one that acquisitions and folks who support acquisitions will use. So we'll have some of that flexibility, but all of us civilians will be Department of the Air Force civilians. It's similar to how it is in Department of the Navy as well.
Awesome. So we've talked a little bit about back and forth with the Air Force, and now about back and forth with industry and wider parts of the space community. We've had questions about, will there be opportunities for early education exchanges with industry or sponsored reserves in other kinds of space companies? We've talked a lot about the digitalness and the innovation in the Space Force, and how does that play into industry?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've always had some ability to go back and forth, typically a little bit more at the field grade officer level. But I was just really excited with my colleagues out at Space Command, Systems Command, that came up with a program last summer when we brought on the lieutenants, and again, because of COVID, we commissioned them early in April, and they came up with a program that allowed those lieutenants to have a couple of week experience at various industry that are around in California that support the space industry. Just a great opportunity for them to get anywhere from 2 weeks to a month to 3 months of exposure at an early part in their career. So yes, here is a service that is very, very dependent on a great partnership between industry, academia, and the service itself, and intend to continue that.
All right, so we just have a couple minutes before I know we have to let you go. So I'll ask one final question, and that's, what are you the most proud of in standing up the U.S. Space Force this past year? 2020 brought some unprecedented challenges, but also clearly from what you've described already, some unprecedented progress and success. So what are your highlights that you most are proud of in Space Force?
Yeah, I have to say that it's two in particular, and there were so many great opportunities that reflected all those achievements done by so many other folks on the team. But for me, it was on April 19th to be able to watch those 86 new lieutenants take the oath of office into the Space Force from the Academy. And it was the 7 recruits on the 19th of October who were at 2 MEP stations, one in Denver, Colorado, and one here locally in Baltimore, and took their oath of office into the Space Force. That to me just represents this incredible talent, dedication, and inspires us for the future, who come just from all walks of the nation and are going to help us build this new service. And that's what's going to move us forward. And that's what I am just was so proud of this past year.
That's amazing. And we could keep talking about all of these issues for another hour, but I know you have to go. So thank you so much for speaking with me today, for all the work that you're doing with the Space Force, and really just best wishes and Happy New Year.
Great. Thank you so much, Robin. And thanks for everybody that's tuned in today as well. I would just also say, stay tuned. There's a lot more to follow.
Thanks, I appreciate that.
Thank you.
And as Ms. Mulcahy just mentioned, it's now time to transition to our second half of the event, which will hopefully be really dynamic, in-depth, and provide a new level with this panel discussion among current Space Force and U.S. Space Command personnel. I'm very excited for this opportunity to hear from some of the folks who face the challenges and opportunities we're discussing every day. And with these 4 people, we've managed to collect an impressive diversity of experiences, representing officers across multiple services, enlisted personnel, government civilians, contractors, and reservists. Leading the way as our panel moderator is none other than Dr. Paula Thornhill. I know Paula from my time as a student at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, where she's the Associate Director of the Strategic Studies Program. Dr. Thornhill is a retired Air Force Brigadier General, and prior to coming to SAIS, spent 10 years at the RAND Corporation as a leading scholar on a number of issues that we're discussing today. Dr. Thornhill will be interviewing the following 4 panelists. Lieutenant Colonel Brandon Davenport is the commander of the 2nd Space Warding Squadron for the U.S. Space Force. Mr. Ben Millspaugh has 2 positions relevant to our chat today. As a civilian, he is a program manager for TMC Design, and as an Air Force reservist, he is the 710th Operations Group Superintendent. Lieutenant Cynthia Burkett recently commissioned as a Space Force officer after 9 years as Air Force enlisted. And finally, Mr. Bob Fabrizio is a civilian serving in the Future Operations Division, J35, for U.S. Space Command. Well, that is enough from me. Dr. Thornhill, please take it away.
Terrific, and thank you, Robin. It's a privilege to be here, and it's a privilege to be joined by such a terrific group of panelists. And if you haven't turned on your cameras yet, panelists, so that would be Bob, Benjamin, Ben, and Cynthia, terrific. That way I can actually see you all. For basically how I'm going to run the panel, we have a lot of different ranks, a lot of different experiences. I'm going to use first names, so if I don't want to offend anybody, I just want everybody to know that I'm doing that. I find that it facilitates conversation. Robin will be sending me questions via text, and to the panelists, just do a 2-finger if there's something that one of your fellow panelists is saying that you want to jump in on. Just wave your hand at me, and we'll do it the old-fashioned analog way to jump in and keep the conversation going. What I'd like to do is to start with Bob and with Benjamin. If you looked at their CVs, and it's interesting because our keynote speaker also, all 3 of them have Army backgrounds. And so to get at this issue of culture, what I'd like to do is to start, let's go ahead and start with Benjamin. I would like to get your ideas about what the Space Force should learn from the Army when it comes to growing an effective service culture. And then Bob, you're going to pick that one up next.
Great, thank you for the question. Hello, everybody. A quick comment before my answer. So from my unique experience, I've been pretty fortunate to work tactical operations with every single service, either as a civilian or a military member. So as you alluded, so I started in the Army. So the bleed over or the cultural takeaways from the Army that I think the Space Force can really capitalize on is the mission first, but the understanding that the tactical environment can change at a moment's notice. So in the Army, from my personal experience, we, the saying is, train as you fight, fight as you train. So for the different units and stuff that I was involved in, what we saw was very, very rigorous wargaming, blue versus red and vice versa. And what that ended up driving from a cultural perspective was an expectations of excellence, but also a level of understanding that beyond just your job jar, you had to understand what the person in the foxhole next to you, metaphorically speaking, was assigned and responsible to do. And so while you have your primary roles and responsibilities straight up, right, there's times in scenarios where because of unforeseen circumstances, either in the surge of effort or whatever, they're unable to necessarily cover down on that. So that level of understanding and the flexibility to be able to still continue to execute the tactical mission is going to be key going forward from a cultural perspective.
Bob?
Yeah, so I take it someone else is unmuting me. I'm only my first Zoom call. So if you can hear me, obviously, with the laugh. Yeah, I think Benjamin's spot on. I would add on, I've been I was a space officer in the Army, and 18 of my last 19 years as a space person, I've been at a joint or national level. So actually only one little sliver of 1 year as an Army space person, really. Otherwise, I've been at a joint staff. But as I came in to be a space person and as an FA-40, one of the common lines at the time was that the Army used, as a user, the Army was like 80% versus 20% of the use of Space Force, space capabilities, which always seemed kind of strange. But if you think about it, especially think about it 20 years ago, who was using GPS on the ground? Who was using the kind of the tactical level, whether it's getting mapping data from satellites and that sort of thing? Someone eventually came up with a number of 80% of the space use is the Army and ground forces, but of course it was provided from the Air Force. And so that was always a big thing. SATCOM's another one I left out there, but obviously talking on a satellite radio, very common for a person in a tactical experience, as Benjamin kind of brought up. So yeah, I think that's a big part of it. What I think, and I think Ms. Mulcahy brought it up a little bit, was the as we grow and bring in other services into the Space Force, it definitely is worth getting the culture from all the services as opposed to just relying on the quick move of Air Force to Space Force. So I think that'll be very valuable to come from all services, and certainly the Army is a big one of those.
Okay, thanks, Bob. Brandon, if you would like to comment on either of those, feel free to go for it. But I also would like to throw in and complicate yours just a little bit more. You're a first generation commander in the Space Force. And back in the day, dealing with folks in the Space Force, dealing with folks in the acquisition community, dealing with folks with engineering backgrounds, there was a lot of difficulty connecting them to the military's mission, especially when it came to the idea of fighting and dying. Number one, do you confront that as a commander? Number two, does the Space Force creation help that or hinder that?
Yes, ma'am. Real quickly, actually, it's an interrelated response. So I'll just piggyback on, in my career, I actually started the Air Force, my Air Force career as a developmental engineer, as a 6-2E, as we're called. As an acquisitions professional, I ended up switching over to space operations about at my 9-year mark. And so to me, it's very interesting as I look through my career of just having been on both sides of that fence. After I transitioned to space operations, I was able to go out to the Air Operations Center, the KOC at Al-Udeid, where I spent a year as a space cell chief on the operations floor there. And one of my biggest takeaways is my lieutenants are probably tired of hearing me talk about it, to be honest, is just how important what they do is to the folks that are in a theater. And if folks aren't aware what the 2nd Space Warring Squadron does, we operate the Space Infrared System, SBIRS, which actually this evening is the anniversary of the Iranian attack against Iraq, bases in Iraq, U.S. forces in Iraq, that I'm happy to report that the squadron here was able to provide warning to theater 1 year ago. And a lot of times to them, on the screen, it's hard to understand that concept, especially since most of the folks in the squadron are first couple of years of service in the Air Force and Space Force. So I find it very important. It is something I feel like I confront. I make them understand that there's, most times on the other end of that phone, there's not somebody at risk of being hurt. As we have reported thousands of missiles, I'll just say, over the past year. More often than not, those missiles are not shot in anger. So you could tell, I was there on the outfloor that a year ago. There was this weird surrealness of, it was just like every other day, except we knew that there was U.S. and allies in harm's way, and that did matter. And it has shifted my squadron's focus. I think I make the joke, I wasn't Chicken Little, right? When I came into command, it was one of my focuses to reinvigorate didn't miss a warning because of my time at IUD and just how important it was for my young guardians and airmen to understand how important their role is. And unfortunately, or fortunately, the Iranians give a very good exclamation point to that statement. And so I do think my unit might be a bit lucky right now in that we have a very recent event that I can point to that has a very clear impact to our joint and terrestrial. I like to say our terrestrially based partners in the world.
Brendan, if I could push you on that just a little bit. One of the things that's interesting is that most people in the Space Force won't deploy. So you have a very unique and important experience there. How do you make that real to people that won't have your deployment experience?
Well, actually, one of the things where we are just we've done one event of these, but we're actually looking to create a rotational training event because we are so small in Space Force. I think it's going to be very important that our joint and coalition partners come interact. And so we are setting up what we call a theater event exercise, a TESX, that we want to actually start on a rotational basis with every combatant command that is under risk of missiles. So we've done one event with CENTCOM. We're actually looking to do a European command event this spring, COVID willing. And our intent is to do these recurring 18 months events so that my lieutenants can see face to face the joint partners that we are providing warning to, and we can work through TTP, techniques, tactics, procedures, and we can humanize. In my view is my point is to humanize who is on the other end of that warning. Also, we are pretty lucky. We do typically get one or two folks that deploy from my unit that are deployed to theater to provide space duty officer support to the KOC.
Thank you, Brandon. Cynthia, so I'm going to ask you the question that comes, it's the big elephant in the room. It's Netflix. It's the Space Force, right? It's Steve Carell. And it's one of the things, you're the newest member of the Space Force. The Space Force is in some sort of fun cultural identity competition with Netflix, at least on one level. So my question to you is, when you have folks that come to you and say, hey, I understand you're a new member of the Space Force. Can you tell me about it? I really don't want to join the military, but space sounds interesting. And I've seen this, I've seen, this Netflix show. Help me understand what's going on.
So I'm really glad you actually asked that question, because that's something I do kind of on a day-to-day basis. I was a part of a podcast recently where I was talking about the Space Force, and I feel like that's kind of one of the biggest issues today, is that a lot of people don't understand what the Space Force is. And then whether, they don't take it seriously because of, political bias or the striking resemblance with Star Trek or the Netflix series Space Force with Steve Carell. It doesn't really make our mission very clear, what we do on a day-to-day basis. And so I find it important because although I don't have a space background, I have just like my degrees and studies in space, I have a deep passion for it and for the mission. So I'm very excited to be in the Space Force and my future in the Space Force. So I try to share that with anybody and everyone, whether it's somebody that I work next to, or whether it's my neighbor, or whether it's on the YouTube platform. I just really want to share the importance of what we do and why we do it. And it is different how the Space Force was created. A lot of times if there's a Space Force update, we're going to see it on Facebook before we hear it from our leadership. So it's very unique, and a lot of people don't like that, which I understand, but we're in a new world where social media is, takes over everything. So whether it be good or bad, but Netflix series and anything else on social media, it helps at least put us out there so that we know we exist. But I think we need to do a better job at explaining why we do what we do and how important our assets are in space. I don't think people realize how dependent we are on those assets up in orbit.
So what's the first thing you would do?
What do you mean?
What, so we're in competition. We're in, basically what you're describing is we're in competition for the narrative. We, the Space Force, and this is an issue that the Air Force has had basically since 1947, that the Space Force is living with an exclamation point. And if you don't seize the narrative organizationally, somebody else is going to seize it for you. And so the question, and if you don't want this, Cynthia, we can pass this back down the line. But one of the questions would be, what's the narrative that you think as a new member of the Space Force that needs to be out there to put that cultural stake in the ground?
So, and that's, I try to be involved as much as possible. So I have a YouTube platform, I have an Instagram platform, I have a Facebook platform. I've been reaching out to podcast members, and people are really just truly asking, what is the Air Force? So I feel like finding every opportunity and explaining, like, hey, day to day, we use GPS for this. We use, satellite communications to communicate with our people overseas. We use, weather satellites to predict these natural disasters. And if we don't have that, it's going to completely be catastrophic to our way of life, not just, military way of life, but everybody day to day, because every time you use your phone and you use GPS, it's, it affects everybody. And by communicating that and saying how, our assets are at risk and communicating that to people at any way possible, I think is very important.
Would anybody else like to take go ahead, Benjamin?
Thank you. So I'll add on to that. The way that I would term it, and the way that I term it to either friends or colleagues or military members, is from a narrative perspective. So I'm a chief on the enlisted side. So as an enlisted guy, I tend to pride myself on being pretty straightforward and candid. So in that vein, we have some very serious struggles and challenges, right? And that's okay. But with those challenges and struggles come an opportunity. And that opportunity at the end of the day, for me, really is to have an impact in something larger than ourselves. So I think that space is unique in that every single service, every airman, every Marine, every soldier, right, in some way, shape, or form, in the large majority of our civilian population, to include what Cynthia was saying, is impacted and touched by space in some way, shape, or form, whether they realize it or not. And so I'll make a semi-contentious statement. So we talk about, from a doctrinal or a state of the world perspective, about being in either a state of competition, all the way to the state of war. So I'm by job, by AFSC, I'm an RF or a cyber guy that's been working in and around space for a really long time. So my view of the world is slightly different. So for me, as a military member, the lens through which I see the world is not competition, but it is always war. And by that, what I mean is that continuum can be operational prep of the environment, meaning the adversaries watching what we're doing to help prepare what they do and how they do it, all the way to active conflict, where they're legitimately trying to disrupt, destroy, degrade, et cetera, our space capabilities. So my overall point in that is, from a culture standpoint, the thing they're trying to drive home to our airmen and our guardians, as well as our civilians and contractors, is the thing that gets a lot of people out of bed, the thing that keeps people in the uniform, right, versus going to get a higher paying job that's a little bit easier, is, for the large majority of us, we believe in something that's larger than ourselves. And being able to map that belief to how we support that, how we protect those soldiers, those airmen, those sailors in our day-to-day job. I know for a fact that I've heard that narrative on the ops floor from Brandon / Colonel Davenport's ops floor. And to his point earlier, they lived that very, very recently and can map back. And I guarantee you, having been one of those guys, that is one of the things that continues to keep us serving and one of the major drivers for cultural foundational building. So forgive me if that's too much, but I'll get off the stage.
No, that's terrific. And actually it tees up a great question that I want to pass off to Bob. and also it builds on a couple of questions that have been in the chat. First of all, there are some, apparently some people are intrigued by actually what J35 does. So if you can give a one-liner on that. And then going to Benjamin's point and knitting a couple of these ideas together, you could take his point and you could extrapolate it a little bit further and say, we created the wrong service. What we needed to do was we needed to take Cybercom, which is a hybrid combatant command, and we needed to take Spacecom, and we needed to put these things together into a cyberspace force, because those two are too inextricably linked, and we sub-optimized by what we're doing. Bob, you've got a lot of time in the combatant command world. So what would be your take on that?
Yeah, okay, thank you. Good questions. So the first one, J35. So again, I'm U.S. Space Command, not to be confused with U.S. Space Force. So one's the warfighting command, the other's the service providing organized training and equip forces, and from that service, for instance, in J35 specifically, we have joint civilians, about 10, actually we have 10 civilians and 10 military members right now. Our military are a combination of now 4 Space Force officers. We still have 2 Air Force officers, and we have 4 Army FA-40 Space Functional Area officers. So already a joint, and eventually, you know, we're growing. We're just a couple months older than Space Force at U.S. Space Command. So we're still building and eventually have some Navy billets on our staff as well. But J35 specifically in the operations division of J3, J35 is the future operations division, one of 8 or 9 divisions in operations. And we pretty much turn plans into operations to go a time horizon. Someone asked me that. We look to future operations at Space Command is defined as 2 months to 24 months. Anything shorter than that's current operations. That's more of an ops center focus or an actual focus of one of our components, or beyond 2 years, it's a planning cycle further out. That said, I could readdress more of that, but back to the other one. So yeah, cyber, you know, a cyber force versus space force, all intriguing questions. The idea of a space force, again, I mentioned earlier when I first became a space person 20 years ago. I mean, there was a big idea, especially with a bunch of us Army space guys getting together in school and training, was, hey, there should be a space force one day. I mean, just like we did, you know, at that, you know, of course, 20 years ago, only 50 years ago, we stood up Air Force out of the Army, right? Why isn't there a space force that breaks off from the Air Force and other services? And I've heard, and since that time, I've heard the same idea with cyber. And of course, we all know that over the last, well, not ever, the last 5 years, both the space mission as a joint function and mission area from Unified Command Plan, as well as cyberspace mission, have both broken off now and stood up separately from what was underneath U.S. Strategic Command, where I did serve for, I guess I was in Strategic Command for 14 years total. So space and cyber both broke off. So still at the combatant command level, the organization, 4-star generals charged with those particular mission sets, I still think fit separately. There certainly is a lot of overlap, and there has been times, you know, we have actually tackled that at a command level of what exactly, you know, you go to a unit that's doing satellite communications. Is that a satellite thing, or is that a communication thing, which is really just a means of doing cyber and, you know, moving data over a network? And it's you know, it's an age-old question, and we've always kind of split the difference, even at a unit level. And I don't know if Brandon has any experience with that. At a unit level, you go to SATCOM squadron. You know, are you you know, now it's easy because you're a Space Force guy, but, you know, are you a space guy, or are you a cyber guy or gal? So I don't know if that addresses the exact question, but I personally, I'm a big fan of the Space Force. So the idea that it could be a cyber and space or space cyber space is definitely intriguing, to say the least.
Well, and thanks, Bob. And Brandon, he teed you up. I want to get your reaction to that. And I also want to take on one of the questions that was in the chat, which is about what should the services keep and not turn over to the Space Force. And if you think about it from a roles and missions perspective, right? It's did the services keep all the cool stuff? I've heard anecdotal stories about recoding people so that they were no longer space folks. I've heard anecdotal conversations from senior, in this case, Army folks, who have talked about that they're going to eat the Space Force's lunch because they actually know what they want out of Leo and things like that. So there is competition. From your perspective, as somebody who isn't only a commander, but also has got some considerable staff time, what do you see as sort of that optimal spot where the Space Force is, has the primary role, but the other services continue to keep core competencies?
Yes, ma'am. I thought a lot about that recently in some conversations I've had with my peers and bosses. I'll tell you right up out of the gate, I bet you we're not going to get it right initially. My biggest fear is that we open up a gap by, making it wholesale, a binary, if you pardon the cyber joke, a 1 or a 0, right? You're either Space Force or you're not. I think that would likely lead to some gaps in capability. As I look at other services, there does seem to be, I shouldn't say always, but there does seem to be purposeful thought in how each service, transitions from domain to domain. If you accept the basic premise that most of the services are organized around a domain primarily, I know that analogy falls apart when you look at like carrier strike groups, but it is interesting to me where I see, the Navy and the Air Force train together. There's a red flag. There's a weapons school, fighter weapons school, U.S. Air Force weapons school, Top Gun exchange program. Whether or not I need cyber professionals that are the folks that manage my ground infrastructure, for example, for SIBRs, or if I need space operators. I think some of that we need to let the data build a little bit. As an individual, I'm cautious about making factual decisions without data. And in some cases, since we are just a year old, I do think we can allow some school hard knocks to apply that lets us know what does work and what doesn't work. Part of that bold and agile means we're going to fail a little bit, I think. And I'm actually okay with that failure as long as it doesn't result in a critical mission failure or loss of life. There was another question you asked me too, I think, that I didn't answer yet.
So when it comes to sort of the inevitable resource competition between the Space Force and the other services, and we're about ready, we know we're about ready to get into another one of these competitions for resources. Is this something where you're comfortable that at the and I recognize this is a the old that could be well above my pay grade. This could be a 3 and a 4 star question, but it goes back to how core you think your service is, the Space Force is, to being the primary provider of that capability. How comfortable are you with a significant resource being retained by the other services as well as the IC? Or is that something where you think over time that just needs to migrate to the Space Force, for the good of the country?
Okay, so I will preface this is purely Brandon's opinion. This is definitely not a U.S. government or U.S. Space Force position, but in my mind, there's kind of 3 different bins of discussion there. In my mind, so one thing I would like to influence Space Force's thought is that we should be able to have a mindset where, I'll just use the analogy of a blue water Navy and a brown water Navy, if that resonates with some folks. We as a central idea to the force, it does make sense to me that Space Force should organize, train, and equip who have the capability to defend and act in the domain. And so that's kind of the blue water Navy, right? To be able to gain and maintain some localized space superiority or defend an engagement in the domain, blue water. Brown water, TUSWIS is SBIRS is a brown water capability in my mind. That capability exists primarily to support terrestrial warfighters. And therefore, while you can make the argument because it's a terrestrial warfighting support, maybe that belongs in somebody else's service. I don't think so. The same way that you wouldn't give the Army or the Marine Corps amphibs, that's a Navy Corps competency to bring that capability to shore. In my mind, the Space Force needs to have a capability to provide terrestrial, force enablers. That's in most cases that's our heritage anyway, right? GPS, missile warning, satellite communications. Those capabilities do seem to make sense to allow us to organize, train, and equip to. Where I think the other services should have some capability to hypothetically, have impacts in the space domain, right? So that doesn't necessarily mean that every single thing that communicates into space needs to be a Space Force thing. I'll use electronic warfare, for example. My personal opinion, if you want to use space electronic warfare, there may be some concepts like the Army's ITQs construct, and I forget the acronym, so I apologize there, but it's a multi-domain capability that the Army is procuring that's supposed to have space, cyber, and some other EW capabilities. If it has space EW in that unit, it might fire into space. What I think makes sense is that breakpoint is going to be, that's a US Space Com, the US UCOM. I'll just say there's a ITQs battalion in UCOM. The coordination of fires into space, that's going to be a combatant command thing. And it doesn't necessarily hurt the service that the Army wants to procure some capability to have fires into the domain, because in reality, to make sure there isn't gaps in all the services, every service operates in every domain in some cases, right? You hear the jokes about the Army has more boats and more planes than the Army, than the Air Force, and the Navy, and so that's not going to that construct, I think, will still apply to Space Force, but I do think the centralized point about a blue water, brown water Navy, or a on-domain capability for Space Force is a centralizing idea, one centralizing idea, and the second centralizing idea is that Space Force provides capabilities to the terrestrial force. It doesn't mean all capabilities, but it probably means most.
Go ahead, Benjamin.
So agree with everything Brandon just said. I'm going to rephrase it slightly and then add in one additional thing, Ben Millsap's opinion. So if you look at it from, again, the way I see the world from a warfighting continuum perspective, is there are times where the United States Space Force is going to be, their assets are going to be supporting, and then there are going to be times where their assets are supported in order to execute a warfighting plan, depending on what stage of conflict you're in. In addition to that, the Space Force, from a capabilities perspective, we find ourselves in an interesting position in that more and more with the technological progression and the speed of progression of industry, the United States military is in the Department of Defense, as well as the intelligence community, is taking advantage of the technological progression that within industry can occur very, very quickly. And to Colonel Davenport's point, they can fail early and fail fast and deliver capability faster than our traditional acquisition process can. It just is what it is. So my point is, I'll give a weapons officer answer to answer your question directly. It depends. But to the question in the chat with regards to from the U.S. Marine Corps Colonel, personal opinion, there is a required amount of duplicate capability because U.S. Space Force or Air Force priorities that are supported by, we'll say, a space electronic warfare capability is not necessarily the same as a U.S. Marine Corps capability in order to execute the same operational plan. So we find ourselves in a unique position in that sometimes we lack the numbers or the capacity to be able to execute all of the different missions required at the same time to successfully implement or execute a plan. So big picture, industry is rolled into there as well. So satellite communications was tossed out there. So as our carrier strike group transits the Pacific or the Atlantic, in a lot of cases, right, we're using those commercial satellite links to get information to and from those surface warfare vehicles as they transit. If that goes away, now that commercial asset has then become a military target, and then we have to make sure that we're coordinating across services, across industry, and the combatant command that's responsible for that to make sure that those abilities and those capabilities can hit kind of the marks. So again, I apologize, it's lots of words. I get paid by the word for the record, so there you go. I digress.
Thank you, Benjamin. And actually, I want to come back in a little bit to this point about the relationship. And once again, I think it's showing up in the chat, the relationship between commercial space and militarized space. And in fact, is militarized space chasing it? I want to come back to that in a bit. But I want to go, I'm intrigued by this thing called Guardian. And I'm intrigued by our keynote speaker's remark about what a big tent the Guardian is. And all of you, we have active duty, we have reserve, we have contractor, we have civilian. When the Air Force went through this about 5 years ago about airmen, and it built this huge tent that everybody was an airman, only to find out that it actually alienated and offended a fair number of contractors and civilians in particular who said, I didn't sign up to be an airman. Why are you calling me an airman? So it sounds like we're building a big tent right now for the Guardians. Cynthia, I would like to start with you, and then I want to walk through all all four of you of how big of a tent should the Guardian be? Because when the minute you make it inclusive, you create one set of problems. The minute you make it exclusive, you create another set. Cynthia, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so the Guardians kind of started a whole nother spiel, you know, with like our Delta looking like the Pontiac symbol, the Space Force, you know, Netflix series where, you know, with the Guardians, everybody's calling us the Guardians of the Galaxy, and it's just another kind of reason to pick at us, which, I mean, technically, you know, it's somewhat true. But, you know, we talked a little bit about culture, and we haven't really built one. And, you know, although initially people are hesitant towards, I mean, I feel like, you know, no matter what nomenclature you choose, it's not going to be fitting for everybody. So I feel like it was an appropriate term to use, especially because that has some historical value from I think the origination of the Space Command. So I agree that, you know, we have to start, you know, building our culture somewhere, and by you know, assigning us a Guardian nomenclature, I think that was appropriate.
But to you, it's a large tent.
I believe so, yes. The Guardian, you know, like I said, it's hard to tell how big or little it is just because it's so new, and especially because people don't know how big the Space Force is going to be. And there's a lot of offense, especially, you know, with the Guard and other branches saying, how are we, you know, to call us the Guardians? Like, what gave us the right, you know, for being a new branch? But I feel like it's a good start.
Bob, are you a Guardian?
I am not. I'm a Guardian wannabe, I guess. So, and Miss Mulcahy mentioned it a little bit, right? So the civilians, we're still Air Force civilians, so Department of Air Force civilians, which actually, so I think Guardian is a big tent. I 24 plus years in the Army, plus pre-commissioning even. So, you know, when I became an Air Force civilian after retiring from the Army, it was always a little weird and still was uncomfortable to see things. For instance, you know, I get a New Year's message that comes out of the Secretary of the Air Force office, as well as from the Chief of Staff of the Air Force, the senior enlisted, as well as now the Chief of Space Operations. Get that, you know, kind of a holiday message. And it always starts off, you know, addressed to airmen. And I'm like, well, I don't know if I'm really an airman. I'm a Department of Air Force civilian. And then over the last year, changed to airmen and space professionals. So that's it. I'm definitely a space professional. I got that part, no doubt about that. Now I haven't seen a new one. I guess maybe there may be one. Perhaps the next holiday weekend we'll see one, and it'll say to dear airmen and guardians. I don't know what the next one will be. I imagine that will be at a point. But I think guardian is kind of a clean break, clean slate, maybe to be more encompassing. Again, I never really felt like an airman, but that may be because I've only been on Air Force side for 8.5 to 9 years, and at the same time, the I don't know what else you call us, airmen and their civilian supporting personnel. It just kind of is kind of interesting. So I think Guardian's pretty broad, and I think it is a large tent, which also, I mean, the contractors we have that support the Space Force and the community. I think Guardian's kind of a good catch-all. So whatever the word would have been, but Guardian, I like it.
Benjamin, with your contractor hat on, not with your reserve hat on, are you a Guardian?
I support the Guardians.
So but you're not a Guardian then?
No, so from a company perspective, right? I mean, to be frank, right? Like we support whoever pays us. And on one task order or one contract, I may be a Guardian or supporting Guardians. And on another, I may be supporting a sailor. So it just kind of depends on what customer you're supporting and how that maps to identity-wise, the mission that you're on contract to do.
So what happens when you have senior Space Force leaders who want to call you a Guardian? Do you just ignore it?
All right, so here's my disclaimer. Ben Millspaw, enlisted guy. I don't care. The thing that I care about is at the end of the day, the systems that I build and deliver, they do their job to keep people alive. You can call me a piece of crud for all I care. As long as it does its job and keeps people alive, solid.
Okay, so from your perspective, the whole thing about Guardian is really a non-issue. Big tent, small tent, but with your contractor hat on, the single most important thing is with whom is that contract and what are the terms of that contract in terms of compensation and what's actually in the contract that needs to be fulfilled.
From a legal perspective, sure, right? I mean, at the end of the day, right, contracts are legal binding documents. And yes, of course, that's got to be right, the backdrop or the foundation. So personally, I consider myself a teammate, right? I'm getting paid to do a job just like everybody in uniform is. But at the end of the day, I can go find another job. So I'm here in this job as a contractor, as many of my brethren and sistren are, because as I said before, I believe in something larger. I want to support and help my customer, whoever it is. So I guess to a degree, yes, but also to a degree from an identity and a support perspective, that absolutely matters to me personally.
So,
that answer?
That's helpful. Because this is all about what you can proclaim big tent, small tent. We can call you guys grasshoppers, right? But unless you actually internalize it and it means something to you, the same thing that happened to take the A-10, for the fun of it, right? It's in theory it's the Thunderbolt 2, but everybody calls it the Warthog, right? That's how it grew up. That's what people.
That's right.
That's how culturally it became inculcated in the Air Force. So this takes me to Brandon, who as a commander, yours is a big tent, right? Do you treat, talk about command, talk about, do you command Guardians who are active duty the same as you command Guardians who are civilian, the same way that you command Guardians that are contractors?
So I will step back and one thing I will say is I might have missed the talking point on that because to me, the Guardian moniker was active duty Space Force people currently. And but I want to highlight, I'm going to get to the question very shortly. I do want to highlight though that I think a lot of I do think our senior leaders, and hopefully I'm not putting words in their mouth, but my assessment of what the intent is, if you look at the history of Air Force Space Command or just the history of the Air Force, there was, in the not too far recent past, this discussion about the haves and have-nots, generally centralized around the flights, who got to wear flight suits. within Air Force Space Command. And that, I think, if you looked at some of the climate assessments, there was this feeling, even within Space Command, that Air Force Space Command, that if you were not a operator in a flight suit, you were a second-class entity into that organization. And you hear that, and that actually, as we come out of the Air Force, obviously you hear that in the Air Force as well, right? If you're not a pilot, you're not, you can't expect to be the chief of staff of the Air Force without being a pilot. And so I think that recognition years ago that we wanted to make sure that the team understood their importance, I think that's where this discussion about a big tent comes from. And I'm not sure that people have deeply thought about the secondary effects. See some things about chat about like the Geneva Convention nomenclature. I think a lot of those second and third order effects of this big tent idea. The primary intent was to make sure that the team understands how vitally important they are as a team to execute the mission. And as a squadron commander here at Buckley, exactly to that point, my hope is that a contractor, a reservist, a guardian, a civilian or officer or enlisted, I hope all of them hear the same message from me and actually see the same actions from me that I can't do the job. I'll tell you, like, contractor support, we have Lockheed Northrop Grumman embedded in my crew daily. I cannot do my mission without them. I don't have the expertise myself to do. And so if there's an anomaly or anything that's going wrong with the satellite, it's really mostly contractors telling me what my options are. It's not guardians or airmen. And so on top of that too, I also have valid mission partners. I'm very fortunate. I have Canadians, I have British, Royal Air Force, Australians, that are embedded, Canadians, Australians, British, members that are just as embedded operators of my squadron too. So I hope that the team aspect of it, I don't use the term guardians as a big tent yet, but I'll go back and make sure that maybe that is the intent, but we are definitely a team to execute.
Okay. That's very helpful. And I think actually, this goes back to the overall purpose of the panel, right? With understanding how big of a tent the Guardian force is, and is it a 3-ring circus? Is it a 1-ring circus? Are the rings bigger than one ring bigger than the other? How do you think about that? Cynthia, for you, another possible scene that the Space Force is going to have to deal with is one I think you're very familiar with, which is the officer enlisted divide. We saw early in incarnations of this, especially in the RPV world, or the UAV world, or the drone world, whatever we call it, right? Where you have the pilot and you have the intel analyst sitting right next to each other. Do you see, as somebody who has deep experience in the enlisted ranks, newly commissioned into the officer ranks, do you see this as an issue that the Space Force is going to have to deal with?
So that's actually a really good point, because when I was in my intel background, the enlisted and officer side worked hand on hand, day to day. No matter what mission was, you always had an officer by your side. What I thought was really unique, kind of learning the ropes of space now, is that enlisted and officer are doing the same job on the ops floor. So I'm really intrigued to see how the Space Force is going to form that relationship and that split, if there's going to be a split, in how they're going to just kind of divulge that route.
Do you think there should be a split?
I'm sorry?
Do you think there should be a split?
I mean, I believe so. Yes, I'm pretty new to the space route, but at least on the intel side, the enlisted were very, tactical, heavy, working, more on the ops side, and then in the officer routes, they were kind of managing the mission, making sure, step 1, step 2, step 3, everything on the checklist is checked off. So if the Space Force is going to continue that, that's what I kind of see. But that's just based on my experience.
So Benjamin, I want to give that to you now with your reserve hat on.
You restate the, I was reading a couple of comments that my brain is already going on.
Do you see the officer intel split that especially is, I mean, this is back, in the Spacecom days, this was very prevalent on the ops floor. Do you see this as an enduring issue? Is it something that should be addressed, or is it just something that should continue? And obviously, I'd say, Bob, you'll avoid this, but Brandon, this is going to come back to you with your commander's hat on. Bob, if you want to jump in, you can, obviously. Go ahead, Benjamin.
Well, so if I understand the question, the split between roles and responsibilities between officer and enlisted is specifically within the intelligence community. Is that what you're asking?
No, on the it's on the space ops floor.
Got it. Yeah. So, an underlying theme, right, that you've heard, I think, in most of the comments is we're still trying to sort of figure out and work through the machinations and find efficiencies, et cetera, for those overlapping roles and responsibilities. I know from a cultural perspective, at least in my personal experience, there was a lot of cynicism or confusion that occurred from having an officer and an enlisted do the same job on an ops floor. So I'll weave in a question here in the chat. So one of the questions was asking about warrant officers. So in the Army, having a warrant officer allowed you to have a level of career progression where they could be a technical expert, but didn't necessarily have a lot of leadership roles and responsibilities. Whereas the enlisted corps primarily was focused on the tactical execution, and within the officer corps was looking at the operational and the strategic implications for the directions that was taking place. So to answer your question, yes, I think it's going to have to get addressed. Candidly, I think we're to a degree until the dust starts to settle. I don't think a clear path is going to be super easy to spot as we move forward.
Brandon, is it a commander's issue?
It's interesting to me. One thing I'll highlight, most of my young guardians, there's a lot of them that can't even drink yet. So, it's something to mention that a lot of these folks are just a few years out of high school. And so in my mind, a lot of times it comes down to maturity. I do expect more out of lieutenants just because they are a bit older than the younger guardians. So in some cases, I do have folks that are doing the same job. Although, to Ben's point, I've actually, while they might have the same job on the floor, the tasks I give them to develop a squadron are different, right? And so the lieutenant might have the same exact buttons to click. Actually, it's usually not the same case, but there are some positions on my floor that's true. But the tasks I give them for, say, advanced training or to think through long-term development for the squadron, I would give that to a first lieutenant before a 2 or 3 stripe guardian, just because I don't think it's fair to ask the guardian to think that young enlisted member to think in that bigger construct. Now, they may be able to, and in some cases, I have folks that, some of my younger enlisted do have master's degrees and they have the capability. It really comes down to almost like this puzzle piece that I'm trying to create on the weekly, right? As tasks come into the unit, I try to best assess what talent pool I have while still hopefully pushing all of my folks to progress within their, without asking too much of them. And that is a balance that I don't think I have exactly right myself. But like Ben said, I think some of it will shake out here in what the Space Force's intent for that might shake out. And then hopefully I will then, commanders always look at things in the, our time horizon is usually 6 months, right? I'm trying to, within my 6 month horizon, I'll be prepared to tack as the wind blows, if you pardon the naval pun.
Hey, yeah, so a couple things to add to that. So, after hearing all of you guys talk, and then you mentioned like the new organizational layout and how there's less leadership roles, so kind of less roles to fill as an officer, at least compared to the Air Force type. Understood that we have a smaller organization, but it kind of leads me to think about like if there's less leadership roles, then I feel like there's more room for that warrant officer, and especially because Space Force is very tactical driven. it leaves more room for that warrant officer side of the house. And because, especially with the Space Force recruiting very talented individuals, whether they have a degree or not, especially with STEM backgrounds, I feel like we could take that risk where we put more responsibility on those talented young people, whether they're enlisted or whether, you know, they're officer, and kind of have a blend of that enlisted or that warrant officer side on the tactical level.
So some interesting, what you're talking about are some interesting tweaks to the personnel system that would be distinctly different from the Air Force system that you broke off from. It's interesting. Okay, so we've got about 10 minutes left. I have one quick round question I'm going to ask you right at the end before I hand it back to Robin. But what I'd like to do now is to give each of you just about 2 minutes. The title of the conference is Greatest Opportunities, Greatest Challenge. So what I'd like to do, Bob, I'd like to start with you, and I'm just going to work through the four of you. What is the greatest opportunity and what's the greatest challenge that you see facing the Space Force right now from where you're sitting?
Yeah, thanks. I love going first. So I think in a way they're almost the same. I think the biggest challenge, we kind of talked about it in one of the earlier questions, is figuring out how to integrate the other services. And it was talked about during the fireside chat part, you know, bringing in those other services, the Army, the Navy, and even Marine capabilities and what comes into the Space Force, and, you know, those personnel becoming guardians, if you will. So I think that's probably the biggest challenge going forward, and as you joked earlier, is well above any of our pay levels, and we'll see how that all happens. Every service, of course, looking after their own rice bowls in those capabilities. Opportunity, then, I think it also, I mean, it's kind of with that. It's developing the culture. I mean, we have the perfect time to create the culture that we want. And of course, again, it ties back to one of the other questions with the Netflix and the series and stuff. You know, unfortunately, with the media the way it is today, there's no way that we could have gotten ahead. You know, it'd been nice if Space Force had our uniform and our ranks and everything out ahead of it, but there's no way. No, 1947, the Air Force didn't really have to worry about that. But I think developing that culture is the opportunity to just make it so it makes sense. We know it's a highly technical. We heard those things about being digital. It needs to be lean and mean kind of things. So that's the opportunity.
Benjamin.
So for me, the biggest challenge is our history and our past. By virtue of levels of risk aversion, policy, levels of engagement and risk, right? Whether at the larger level within our country's leaders or at the lower levels on the tactical side. I'm a bit of a nonconformist, so I tend to question rules quite a bit and try to encourage my folks to question them as well. Not that rules are a bad thing, they keep us safe, but sometimes doing things because we've always done them that way can really undermine a culture of innovation, a culture of being lean and being able to engage where we're needed to. That can erode that. So from an opportunity perspective, the opposite is true. I think our future is candidly our biggest opportunity. We have the ability to do things that have never been done before. We have the ability to change potential or challenge policies that may not make sense anymore. We can take our advanced training, our career progression, our levels of roles and responsibility, how we do all of those things. We have an opportunity to learn from the mistakes of our services, from our heritage, and potentially set them on a better course for our future.
Cynthia, let me go to you next.
Awesome. So I kind of already touched on it a little bit. For the opportunity is working with the commercial and space industries I know General Thompson has mentioned it before, and Patricia talked about it a little bit earlier in the beginning about how the program with, working with space industries for a couple weeks and then coming back. But General Thompson also talked about enhancing that program where it could be a couple years at a time. So if someone's in the service and they want to go work for, SpaceX or, any other space industry, they can go to that company and then come back. And it's really beneficial on both sides because it helps that relationship between the service and all of the other industries. And then also by going to those industries and then coming back into the Space Force, they'll bring more innovative ideas and bring a lot more to the table as a service. And like I said, it just benefits both sides. So I feel like that's an amazing opportunity that the Space Force is going to bring. And then I've already mentioned the challenge, which I'm kind of passionate about, is to publicize our mission and getting our, Space Force purpose known. And I feel like I find that I take that to heart because, we need to get our mission known, especially to the younger people, because there are future generations and they're the future to our Space Force. So if they don't know exactly what the Space Force is, and if it's not for them, how are they going to set themselves up and, be prepared to be in the world's greatest Space Force?
And Brandon.
So I will say I think the biggest challenge is going to be resources. We talked about, it's going to be very hard to fill out the staffs of all these new organizations to an effective level to fight the rice bowls, the rice bowl fights that's about to occur, right? So as you stand at Star Command, as Spock normalizes General Raymond's staff at the Pentagon, the consequence of being lean means that you better run it pretty fast with the lean folks that you have. And so I do think that, it takes to have the 10 to 15 year, that 10 to 20 year pool of people of experience. Those are the folks that are going to get stretched pretty thin here, I think, in the next probably half decade, unless we have some innovative ways to onboard more people, more resources to put towards these problems. That said, I do think that we are small enough. I'll just give a vignette. Something very interesting to me is ever since Space Force stood up, when I have personnel issues or things I need to go after to help young guardians or lieutenants, I have conversations with 3-stars about lieutenants. Now, I don't always win those arguments, but the fact that I'm even having that discussion is new to me. Chief Tollerman has helped me on a few airmen, guardians, personally, right? There's been communications from the squadron commander to the chief, the chief enlisted leader of the Space Force, or to the 3-star commander. And so that discussion about removing those layers of management in the middle, I do see that. I see that in my position now, and I do think that gives opportunities to, if you allow me to go back to the analogy about a puzzle, allow us to really make that fit the right pieces in the right spots because we are so small.
Okay, so here's the quick question. It's just a yes or a no. The Space Force was driven by external circumstances, large political factors. It has a nascent culture, as we've talked about, resource competition going on. Yes or no, that's all you can say. You can't say and, but, or anything else. Was it created too soon? Bob?
No.
Cynthia?
No.
Brandon?
No.
Benjamin?
Nope.
Okay, I'm a yes. And that's where I'm going to end. And then I'm going to turn it back to Robin. A couple of thoughts to leave everybody with. There's a saying in the military, I'm sure all of you have heard it, culture eats strategy for lunch. So what happens when you don't know what your cultural origins are? One of the things we didn't get the opportunity to really explore is what happens when those cultural origins are so deeply tied to the commercial realm. And it's a whole nother area that needs to explore. What happens when what you're describing is an immensely important service to the nation, but it might not be a military service. Are we using the wrong lexicon, or are we using the right lexicon to explain and describe what the Space Force does? I think that's my personal view, is that is an immensely important issue to explore, and it's something that can be explored without denigrating an iota how important the mission is. I'll end it on that note. Robin, back to you. I think you guys were terrific. This is the first time I met you all, other than a brief intro the other day. Just thank you so much.
Yes, thank you, Paula. Thank you to all of our panelists. Thanks to Patricia Mulcahy and everyone who made this event possible. Finally, thank you to our attendees for your time, your questions, your interest in this very important topic. We got deeper today than I even imagined that we would manage to achieve in just an hour and a half. And I hope you were all able to gain some new knowledge today as we look to the future of the U.S. Space Force. The recording of this event will be made available in the coming weeks. For further space policy research, recordings of our space policy show, and any future papers and discussions on this topic, please check out our CSPS website at aerospace.org/policy. Thank you all. Stay safe and healthy, and have a happy new year.
Thank you.